I've never been good at being introduced. Most people get better at it over time. They learn to say their name with a little authority, a little warmth. I spent 34 years learning to say mine as quietly as possible, like an apology. My name is Claire Harlow. I run a real estate development company. We own 11 commercial properties across 3 states, including 4 boutique hotels. None of my family knows this, or at least they didn't. That changed on a Saturday in October. My brother Daniel got engaged in April to a woman named Simone Voss, and the engagement party was scheduled for an October weekend, a proper event, a sit-down dinner at a luxury venue in the city. When the invitation arrived in May, I noticed I was the only person in the family who received a save the date instead of a proper card. My mother and my Aunt Claire got monogrammed envelopes. Mine was a printed cardstock insert tucked into a plain envelope, the kind venues use for dietary restriction forms. I still went. I go to everything. That's the thing nobody ever says about the overlooked child. They show up anyway. They show up early and they stay late, and they never say a word about the fact that every gathering in their family's life is another small confirmation of what they already know. They are scenery, not story. I drove myself. I wore a good dress. Dark navy, clean minds, nothing expensive looking, which is the only way I know how to dress for family events. I've learned that looking too polished invites questions. Looking too plain invites pity. The middle is invisible, which is exactly where I've always lived. The venue was called the Ashford. I knew it well. Our company had done a consultancy review of the property 3 years ago when it came on the market. We passed on purchasing it because the structural renovation costs were prohibitive. But I remembered the layout perfectly. The grand entrance staircase, the east ballroom with its carved plasterwork ceiling, the service corridor that ran the full length of the building behind the kitchen. I walked in and handed my coat to the attendant. He thanked me and said, "Right through the doors, miss." I said thank you and walked in alone. Simone was, by any reasonable measure, beautiful. She had the kind of beauty that makes a room adjust itself, men straightening up, women reassessing. Dark hair, expensive posture, a white dress that managed to be appropriate for an engagement party while also making it absolutely clear whose night this was meant to be. I noticed her before she noticed me, which was the pattern of the evening. My mother was beside her, already using the voice she only uses for people she considers above us. I recognized it immediately. The voice she'd used for school principals and doctors, and once, memorably, for a priest she'd met at a fundraiser. It's rounder than her normal voice, more careful. Every sentence ends a half step higher, like a question, like she's checking that she's still welcome in the conversation. She'd never used that voice with me. Daniel sounded me first, which surprised me. He crossed the room with something that looked almost like relief on his face. And for a moment, I thought maybe things would be different. He hugged me and said he was glad I came, and I believed him, because I always believe him. That's the part about loving family that nobody talks about. You keep believing them, even when the evidence is stacked against you. "Simone's been dying to meet you," he said. That was the first lie of the evening. I smiled and let him lead me across the room. Simone was in the middle of a story that involved a vacation in Tuscany and a winemaker named Giancarlo. She paused when she saw me coming, and the pause was a fraction of a second too long, just enough time for her expression to arrange itself from its natural setting into the face she was about to wear for me. "You must be Claire," she said. "I've heard so much about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. "Of course," she smiled. "Daniel says you're in real estate." "Something like that." "How fun." She turned back to her friends before the sentence was fully finished. Not rudely. She was too precise for rudeness. Just conclusively. The way you close a tab you're done reading. That was the second lie of the evening. The first was Daniel's, the second was hers, and the third was mine. I stood there and pretended I didn't notice any of it. I found a spot near the back of the room by the bar, ordered a sparkling water, and did what I've always done at family events. I watched. Watching is a skill I developed out of necessity. When you're not part of the conversation, you learn to read it from the outside. I can tell you when someone shifts from performing happiness to actually feeling it. I can tell you when a smile is load-bearing, when it's holding up a room, versus when it's purely decorative. Simone's smile was entirely structural. It was doing enormous work all evening. She worked the room the way someone works a room when they're executing a strategy, not attending a party. She made rounds. She introduced herself to people by their professional title before their name. You must be the one who runs the firm. Or, I heard you were in finance. She remembered every answer. She filed things. I was watching this when I heard my name. Naut said to me. Simone was standing 15 feet away with two women I didn't recognize, both in the kind of dresses that have a particular brand of quiet expense, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I wasn't meant to hear her. The room was loud enough that she'd calculated the distance as safe. She was wrong. That's Daniel's sister, she said. The one who lives out in, I don't even know, somewhere rural. She works in property management or something. Very sweet. Upbeat. Very simple. The two women with her made the sound that women sometimes make when they want to agree with something they find slightly uncomfortable. Not quite a laugh, not quite a hum. A social smoothing over sound. I stood completely still. I've heard things like that before. I spent my whole life hearing things like that. What surprised me wasn't the content, it was the specific word she used. Simple. Not poor, not uneducated, not irrelevant. Simple. It's a more precise cruelty than people realize. It sounds almost kind until you understand what it actually means. Not worth the complexity of my attention. I took a long sip of my sparkling water, and I started paying a different kind of attention. I want to tell you something about my childhood, because this matters. My family didn't have money when I was growing up. We had enough, sometimes barely enough, but we managed. My father worked construction management. My mother taught piano to neighborhood children. Daniel was the golden one. Track scholarship, business degree, handsome in the way that comes with being effortlessly liked. He never had to work at being in a room. He was just in it immediately and completely. I was the other one. I was the one who read too much and talked too little and spent Saturday mornings following my grandmother around her garden, while she told me things about plants I since completely forgotten, and things about people I've never forgotten at all. My grandmother's name was Ruth, and she was the first person who ever made me feel like my quietness was an asset rather than a deficiency. People talk themselves into trouble, she told me once. You listen yourself out of it. She died when I was 19, in my second year at a university I'd paid for myself with 2 jobs and a partial scholarship. She left me a small amount of money, not enough to be significant on its own, but enough, combined with everything I'd saved, to make my first investment. A 2-unit rental property in a depressed neighborhood that I'd researched obsessively for 6 months before purchasing. That property is now worth 11 times what I paid for it. I tell you this not to be impressive. I tell you this so you understand the version of me that walked into that engagement party. I am not someone things happened to. I am someone who watched very carefully and then built very deliberately for 15 years without ever needing anyone to know. I've kept my family's financial emergencies quiet for 8 of those years. My parents' mortgage, when my father was laid off, my aunt's medical bills, a loan for Daniel's business that was structured as a gift because I knew he'd never pay it back and I didn't want the conversation. I've moved money quietly and carefully and without acknowledgement because the alternative, being seen, being thanked, being treated differently, was a transaction I didn't want to be part of. What I hadn't accounted for was someone else accounting for it. 40 minutes into the party, I excused myself to the restroom, which is a thing I do when I need to think. The corridor outside the East Ballroom was quiet, just the sound of a kitchen, and further down, a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Two voices, a man and a woman. The man was Simone's father, whom I'd been introduced to briefly, Marcus Voss, tall, silver-haired, the kind of confident that doesn't move in crowds, it just expects them to part. The woman I didn't recognize. I slowed. The family account situation needs to be cleaner before we file, the man said. If they run the search and find the gaps, they won't, the woman said. Not before the wedding, and after the wedding, it's restructuring. She's not going to ask questions. Simone knows what she's doing. A long pause. Then, what about the sister? Property management, the woman said, with exactly the dismissiveness you'd expect from someone repeating information they'd received secondhand. Non-issue. The man made a sound of agreement. I stood very still in that corridor for a long moment. The kitchen noise continued. Somewhere inside the ballroom, someone laughed. Then I went back to my table and sent a text to my attorney. Her name is Patricia Morrow. She's been my attorney for 9 years. I have never texted her on a Saturday evening, and she has never not responded within 4 minutes. I need a record search on a Marcus Voss and Simone Voss, I wrote, and whatever entity they're operating through. Tonight. She sent back, on it. How urgent. I looked up at the room, at Daniel laughing with his arm around Simone, at my mother beaming at the table of honor. Very, I wrote back. The toast began at 8:30. Marcus Voss went first, which was a choice. Usually it's the parents of the couple, alternating, or close friends. Going first with a toast at your daughter's engagement party has a specific energy. It's claiming the room before it's been offered. I filed that away. His speech was good. I'll give him that. It was warm and specific and full of anecdotes that sounded real enough to be believed and polished enough to have been practiced. He talked about Simone as a child, about the values he'd raised her with, about the importance of marrying into a family with integrity. He looked at my family when he said the word integrity. My mother put her hand over her heart. I kept my face completely still. He raised his glass and said something about two families becoming one, about new beginnings, about the future being built on honest foundations. The room raised their glasses and clinked them and drank. My phone vibrated. Patricia had sent a document, then another, then 3 more in quick succession. I read them under the table, very carefully, while the next toast began. By the time Daniel stood up to speak, I understood everything. The short version is this. Marcus Voss had been operating a series of investment vehicles that were, in the most charitable reading, profoundly mismanaged, and in the accurate reading, structured to obscure the movement of other people's money. There were pending civil proceedings in 2 states. There had been a similar situation 10 years ago under a slightly different entity name that had been settled quietly. Simone had been present at the founding of at least 2 of those entities. She had a law degree she'd never practiced with and a financial consulting certification that had lapsed 3 years ago. My family, specifically the appearance of my family's financial stability, was apparently relevant to a credit structure Marcus was trying to establish before a filing deadline in 6 weeks. They needed a family that looked solid. Daniel, who was charming and confident and employed, fit that picture. The fact that he didn't actually have significant assets didn't matter, because Marcus had apparently been told, by whom I wasn't sure yet, that there was family money. Quiet money. The kind that moves without leaving obvious traces. He'd heard about the payments I'd made to my family over the years. The anonymous ones, the ones that had kept my parents' house and covered my aunt's surgery. Someone had told him there was an invisible source of funding behind this family, and he'd decided that source could be useful to him, either as a genuine financial backstop or, more likely, as a story he could tell lenders about family resources. He didn't know my name. He knew the sister, and he'd assessed the sister as a non-issue. I set my phone face down on the table and listened to Daniel finish his speech. It was a good speech, warm and unpolished and genuine, the speech of someone who actually loves the person they're standing next to. It was the most painful thing I'd heard all evening. I stepped out into the corridor after Daniel's toast. I needed 90 seconds, and I took them. The thing about being the invisible one in a family is that you develop a very specific skill set. You learn to make decisions in silence. You learn to act without needing to perform the action. You learn that the most powerful things you can do are the ones nobody sees you doing until they can't avoid seeing the result. I called Patricia. She picked up on the first ring. The filings, I said. How verifiable are they? Completely. County records, state business filings, court documents, all public. I can have a summary prepared in 30 minutes that any layperson can read. Do that. Send it to my secondary email. I pause. And can you contact Detective Reyes? Not as a report yet. Just a heads up. I want him to know something may be coming his way. He's going to ask if it's urgent. Tell him a man just gave a toast about integrity while under civil investigation in 2 states, and I thought he might find that interesting. A beat. I'll call him now, she said. I went back in. I found my mother at the side of the room and sat beside her. She looked at me with that expression she's always worn around me. Not unkind, just absent, like she's looking slightly past me at something else. Isn't this wonderful? She said. It wasn't a question. It's something, I said. She patted my hand. It was the warmest thing she'd done to me all evening, and it cost her nothing, and I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her one question. Mom, did you ever tell anyone about the payments? The anonymous ones? She looked at me. Her expression shifted, not toward understanding, but towards something adjacent to it, a kind of dawning discomfort. I mentioned to Daniel that I thought that someone might be helping us. He said he thought maybe you. She stopped. I see. I stood up, very quietly, and walked toward the venue manager's desk near the entrance. The venue manager's name was Stephen. I'd met him briefly when I arrived, and he'd been professional and pleasant and completely unremarkable. I asked him if I could speak with him privately, which he accommodated with the practiced efficiency of someone who handles private requests at private events for a living. I told him I was expecting a guest, a professional colleague who would be arriving at some point in the next hour. I gave him the name. He confirmed the guest would be admitted without announcement. Then I asked him one more thing. He looked at me for a moment after I asked it. That's somewhat unusual, he said. I know. I apologize for the inconvenience. He considered. Is this a legal matter? Potentially. He nodded once, with the expression of a man who has seen more interesting things in his career than he will ever describe. I'll take care of it, he said. I thanked him and went back to the ballroom. Marcus Voss was at the center of a circle of men near the bar, laughing at something. Simone was dancing with Daniel, her head against his shoulder. her face arranged into something that looked very much like contentment. I found my seat. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. It happened at 9:47. The band had just finished a song, and the room was in that particular bright moment between music. Everyone a little warmer, a little more open, the kind of collective softness that makes what happened next hit harder than it would have otherwise. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. She walked in quietly. Detective Reyes's colleague, a woman I'd never met, in a dark blazer, badge visible but not brandished. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. There's a specific quality to the entrance of law enforcement that requires no introduction. A room recognizes it the way a room recognizes fire. Conversation didn't stop all at once. It stopped in ripples, outward from her as she walked toward the center of the room. Marcus Voss saw her from across the room, and his expression did something very specific and very quick. It ran through 4 emotions in about 2 seconds: recognition, calculation, decision, composure. He landed on composure, but it was a fraction of a second too late. His wife took his arm. Simone, still on the dance floor, turned. The detective introduced herself clearly, calmly, processionally. She stated that there were pending civil matters and a developing investigation connected to filings under 2 entity names, which she named. She said she was sorry for the interruption and that she had asked this venue to be the location for a brief conversation that needed to happen before the week's end. "Mr. Voss," she said, "if you'd be willing to step out, this doesn't need to be longer than 20 minutes." The room was so quiet, I could hear the ice settling in someone's glass. Marcus Voss did something I hadn't predicted. He looked directly at me, not with desperation, with recognition, the expression of a man who has just correctly identified the source of a problem that he had filed away as a non-issue. "The sister," he said. His voice was almost admiring. I held his gaze and said nothing. Simone crossed the dance floor toward Daniel. I thought about this moment many times since. What she said, the way she said it. She took his face in both hands, a gesture that was either genuine or the most calculating performance of the evening, and I still don't fully know which. And she told him that she loved him, that whatever was happening was not what he thought, that her father made mistakes, and she had tried to distance herself, and she had not always succeeded, and she was sorry. She said it like someone telling the truth. Daniel looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Did you know about the payments? The money to my family?" Something moved behind her eyes. "Daniel, did you know?" She didn't answer, which was, of course, the answer. He took her hands from his face gently but completely and stepped back. My mother was at my shoulder suddenly. I hadn't heard her cross the room. She was looking at all of it. Marcus Voss speaking quietly with the detective, Simone and Daniel on the dance floor, the guests arranged around the edge of the room in the uncomfortable formation of people witnessing something they weren't meant to see. "Claire," my mother said. "What is happening?" I told her. I told her all of it quietly, standing in the middle of her son's engagement party while the band sat with their instruments in their laps and didn't play. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've been paying for the house." "Yes." "For how long?" 8 years. She closed her eyes. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say, not right then. Some truths need a moment to settle before anyone can walk on them. Someone, I don't know who, told the band to play something. They chose wisely, something quiet and undemanding that gave the room permission to slowly resume breathing. People drifted toward the bar or toward the exits or toward each other. The crisis had shape now, and people could begin to arrange themselves around it. The venue manager found me and asked very quietly if I needed anything. The bar should stay open, I said. People should be able to go whenever they're ready. Please make sure nobody feels rushed. He nodded. Of course. And I want you to know, Ms. Harlow, that if there's anything the venue can. You did everything right, I said. Thank you. A few of Daniel's friends approached me over the next hour. Some of them I'd known since childhood, had watched from a distance for years, had never spoken to for more than a few minutes at a time. They asked what they could do. I told them to be there for Daniel, which was the only thing anyone could do and the most useful thing I could offer. One woman, a friend of Simone's I'd never met, found me near the exit and asked, with the specific courage of someone making themselves do a difficult thing, if I felt good about what I'd done. I thought about the question for a moment before I answered it. I feel like my brother is going to be okay, I said, and I feel like my family isn't going to be used by people who saw them as a financial instrument. Those are good things. But do you feel good? She pressed. No, I said honestly. I feel tired. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded like that was the right answer. Then she left. Daniel called me 2 days later. Not a text, a call. That mattered. He let the phone ring long enough that I understood he'd thought about it before dialing. I answered, and he said, I've been trying to figure out what to say. You don't have to say anything. I want to. A breath. I want to say that I think I've spent a long time watching you from the wrong direction. Like, I knew you were there, I knew you were in the room, but I was always looking somewhere else. I didn't answer immediately. That's an honest thing to say, I finally said. It's the least I can do. Another breath. The payments. Claire, you've been... Daniel. Yeah. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because I could and you needed it, and that's the only math that ever made sense to me. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to thank you for that. Then just maybe call me sometimes. Not because something's wrong. Just to call. A pause. Then, very quietly, yeah, I can do that. My mother took longer. She called 3 weeks after the party on a Sunday morning, which is the only time she ever makes phone calls she considers important. She didn't lead with an apology. She led with a memory. A specific afternoon from when I was 11, when she'd come to pick me up from the library and found me reading a book about property law that I had no business understanding at 11 and certainly had no business enjoying. She said she'd thought, at the time, that I was strange, that she'd worried about me, in the way parents worry about children who seem to live in a different frequency than the people around them. I think I mistook it, she said. What you were. I think I kept waiting for you to become something I recognized, and I missed what you already were. I sat with that for a moment. That means something, I said. I want you to know that. Is it enough? I thought about my grandmother, about the Saturday mornings in her garden, about a quiet 15 years of building something real from the foundation up, without anyone watching, without anyone's approval, without anyone's name attached to mine. It's a start, I said, and starts are what I'm good at. I'm telling you this story because someone told me I should. A woman at a conference last spring, a young woman, early 20s, from somewhere rural and unimpressive by the standards of the room she was standing in, told me that she felt invisible and that she wasn't sure whether to stay quiet or start talking. I told her what my grandmother told me. People talk themselves into trouble. You listen yourself out of it. But then I told her the other thing, the thing my grandmother never got to finish teaching me because she ran out of time. There comes a moment, I said, when being quiet is no longer the safe choice, when it protects them and not you. When it lets the wrong story become the true story simply because you weren't in the room to contradict it. When that moment comes, you speak, not loudly, not dramatically, with the specific calm of someone who has spent years preparing for exactly this. You speak, and you let what you've built say the rest.